afternoon, John Stoneham. How's life in Adelaide?
Very quiet compared to Victoria, I can tell you.
Yes, exactly. I can imagine that you are, shall we say, happier than being across the state line.
Yes, and quite. We are actually being voted the third nicest city to live in at the moment.
Is that the third nicest city in Australia or anywhere else?
No, world. I think the world. Osaka was before us.
I'm going to leave that one well alone. Okay.
Yes, I think we should.
Okay. John Stoneham, known to everybody in the motor racing industry as Stonie, a cartoonist of international repute. I would say that, would I be right in assuming that, let's just start this thing by putting you right on the spot. Do you think that your career in any way mirrors that of the man in England by the name of Mr. Brockbank?
It's interesting that you bring up his name. He was, I followed him enormously. I loved the way that Brockbank, when he drew a Mini or a Bentley or whatever, it looked like that car. And I liked that so much. There were other people that was drawing, a car. I think Ralph Steadman was another one who did Formula One drawings and open wheeler drawings. And so, yes, I loved his style. I had the great pleasure of meeting his daughter at Goodwood in 2012. And it was a real thrill for me because I followed him enormously and I loved his pen work.
Yes, he was one of. I think probably he was the first he was certainly post-war, but he drew a lot of stuff in the immediate post-war period that was pre-war or characterised pre-war.
Oh, indeed. And he was, in fact, an illustrator for the forces. He used to draw enemy aircraft for identification purposes for the Allies.
That's an interesting job. I
So,
don't think either one of us have had that job.
Exactly. Well, his penmanship was very good.
So let's start at the very beginning. What got you into motor racing? I know that you were let's say that you were a car club enthusiast and a car club competitor. Would that have started in the mid to late 60s?
Beginning of the 60s, really, because all I wanted to do was give up my day job or get a day job and buy a Mini. And I joined the Mini Car Club in South Australia at a time when there was a fellow in New South Wales Mini Car Club called Gus Staunton, and he ran things called the National Mini Monty Rallies. And so I was desperate to go in those. I thought that'd be such good fun, and they were. And Gus took a shine to me because I kept drawing cartoons of him. So I learnt a lot from him. So, yes, as you do with car clubs, and I'm sure many people can relate to it, you drive circuit sprints, you go in car trials, you do motor carnas and all that sort of thing. And so you get involved with the sport. But really, I grew up in a motorsport area. I was in earshot of Roley Park Speedway, and our local hero was Jack Young, who won the Speedway final in 51 and 52, I think. So you're indoctrinated into it,
Yes, it's kind of what do they say? It's like osmosis. It seeps up through your feet. You're standing in the dust and the mud, and it just actually creeps up through you and overtakes your whole personality, doesn't it?
It does, and it's second nature to you. It was nothing to hear speed cars being revved up on Thursday night for Friday night Speedway, and you just get, even some of my school friends got involved with it as well. So, actually, the first time I got the cane at school was in grade 5. The teacher came in and he said, this was in 1955, and he said, I've just watched a young man called Jack Brabham win the Australian Grand Prix at Port Wakefield. And I put my hand up and said, no, sir, he drives Speedway. He doesn't drive the roundies. So I got the cane for that.
And you were wrong as well.
Well, Yes, I was wrong. I didn't know Jack was mucking around with other cars. I just knew him as the South Australian Speed Car champion and also the National Speed Car champion, which he ran at Kilburn. Anyway, it doesn't matter.
Oh yes, I mean,
Rough
what was he
getting the cane
at
for
that stage of the game? He was the grocer's son from Hurstville, Sydney.
He was, yes, he was indeed.
That was the start of a long career. So, okay, mid-60s, you've got a job, you've gone out and bought yourself a Cooper S, you've joined the car club, you're into that, but quite obviously you had been let's say, a latent cartoonist long before that, if what you're talking about is school years.
Actually, you would remember a guy called Don Yaffa, who had Yaffa Publications in Sydney.
I do.
I drew a cartoon about rod and dragging for him in 1967. And that was I was doing cartoons for the Mini Club magazine, and I did a couple of cartoons for Gus Staunton in Sydney, just the little bits and pieces here and there. But Don Yaffa was really, he paid me £200 for that, no, $200 rather, for drawing that cartoon book. And that was that gave me an incentive to keep going. And not long after that, I got a job at Adelaide Park Speedway doing cartoons for the Speedway program. And that was also a start of a long ladder that I got jobs from that, which ultimately I ended up out at Adelaide International Raceway doing cartoons for two blokes called Kevin Johnson and Ernie Johnson. Kevin worked for Holden's and Ernie worked for Castrol, and they had JJ's bus, which they hired out to Marlborough. And I ran into Harry Firth in the bus, and he said, "Did you do all these cartoons?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why aren't you doing it for a magazine?" I said, "I don't know any magazines," and he introduced me to Checkered Flag. So basically, from Rowley Park to JJ's bus, that basically was the stepping stone.
It's amazing, isn't it, the coincidental sort of conversations and bump intos that you have through your life that completely change the direction of where you think you were going. A door down the end of that corridor opens up and there's a glimmer of light and away you go. I can imagine that was the days when Harry was running the Holden dealer team. He had plenty of money behind him and he was in a position to offer favours, as it were, and give people like yourself a little direction.
He was amazing, yeah. I mean, I can remember Gabriel Zatmary ringing me and saying, "You come very highly recommended."
Yes, I think anybody who had Harry Firth's imprimatur, the other person definitely paid attention.
Yeah. Yes, I think so, and it was another stepping stone because in 1975 my marriage license ran out and I forgot to renew it, and so did a mate of mine. And he said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "Well, I reckon we'd go to Melbourne and open a T-shirt shop and print T-shirts for the music industry and also car clubs." And he said, "Yeah, what a good idea." And so he learnt to print T-shirts, and we moved to Melbourne in 1975 and opened up a shop in Rathdown Street in Melbourne. But before that, we were sitting in the Marlborough bus at Adelaide International Raceway, and one bloke looked at me and he said, "What do you do for a living?" And I said, "Oh, we're about to go to Melbourne to print T-shirts." He said, "My name is John Evans. I work for Marlborough." He said, "Look me up when you get to Melbourne." So the two clowns from Adelaide arrive in Melbourne and we've already got the Marlborough account.
I mean, in all honesty, as I said a moment ago, doors that open at the end of the corridor that you weren't expecting were even there. I can imagine there would have been thousands of young, hopeful cartoonists and journalists and people who would not believe that you fell into that literally with your eyes shut, and you basically fell into a bucket of money.
Well, I can honestly say that it was more like wasn't a door. It was more like a drawbridge just fell down. We just walked across it. The crazy thing is that there was people who were printing T-shirts in Melbourne, like people like Graham Whincup, who, yes, he is so-and-so's uncle, who said, "Who are these two little pricks from Adelaide who have got the Marlborough account?"
Yes, it's all about being in the right bus at the right time, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Literally, I think, and so through that, and I'd already been doing cartoons for Checkered Flag magazine in Sydney, and it was actually Mark Fogarty who said to me one day, he said, "Why don't you go and see Paul Harrington at Auto Action?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, he could do with a cartoonist." And I said, "But I work for Checkered Flag." He said, "Yeah, that's a monthly." Yeah, he does fortnightlies. And I knew what Auto Action was. So I went and saw Paul, and he sort of looked at me and he said, "Yeah, if you're any good, we'll run you." So, and that was the start of a 40-year period of doing cartoons for Auto Action over a long period of time.
It's amazing, isn't it? You just don't know those connections. And I suppose at that point you had become a professional cartoonist in the motorsport sphere. But I know that you also worked for years and years in the political sphere. Now, how did that bridge take place?
Well, Frank Gardner told me to go to England to broaden my ears, so I did. And I met a fellow in England. I was working for American Air Force magazine, to be honest. And I met a fellow in Belsize Gardens who was a former cartoonist club president of Britain. And he said, "Oh, I'd like to see some of your work." So he had a look. He said, "Son," he said, you'll never be a real cartoonist till you've done politics and worked on a daily paper." And it's funny, you sort of hear those things sometimes and you put them in the back of your head and say, one day I would love to work in a newspaper, and you sock it away. So, I came back to Australia after about a year and worked for Gabriel Zatmer up at Motor and Reporter. And then I came back to Adelaide in 79 to work on the Repco Round Australia trial. And I sort of thought, I'll be cheeky and I'll write to the Adelaide News and ask them if they want someone to fill in over the Christmas period in 1983. And they asked me to come in and start, and just a casual working start. And that's how I got my leg in the Adelaide afternoon newspaper, The News. And I'd only been there for a few days, and then suddenly the Victorian editor came up to me and said, Greg Chappell's just retired from international cricket. He said, "How long would it take you to do a caricature?" I said, "Well, how long have I got?" And he said, 20 minutes. So I did the cartoon, and the editor came out of his office and said, "Who the hell are you?" So that's how I started with the news. So eventually I got to the stage of getting into a newspaper, which is very rare for the Murdoch people because they do not take people from the outside.
Yes, that's, really, when you sort of look at the question, how did you get your start? Again, another one of these classic accidents where
I think so.
there is so little planning involved that you can't even actually register planning. It is just something that happens to you. And you start in that whole exercise of being an enthusiast in motorsport, and you sort of created the bridge was laid out, as you said earlier. The drawbridge came down. You walked across the drawbridge. All of a sudden, you had been in cartooning. You had been in T-shirt printing. You had suddenly you were in motorsport. Now you're in politics, but you kept one foot on each side of the barbed wire fence.
Well, you try. Prior to going to the news, I was working in Sydney and I was working in Sussex Street, and I saw an ad in the paper that would have been 1978, where Larry Pickering was going to launch his 1979 nude calendar. If you remember, Larry used to do nude calendars of people.
Yes.
And I thought, so I went down to the Sussex Hotel in Sussex Street and sort of, got in the door to sort of listen to this launch. And one of the things that Larry Pickering said He said, you have never made it. The only time that you know you've made it as a cartoonist is when you get a death threat. And I sort of walked out of there and thought, oh, God, do I have to go that far? But when I was at the news, I'd only been at the news for about 3 or 4 months, and I did a cartoon about the Russians boycotting the Olympics and blowing out the Olympic flame. And, of course, in the Murdoch industry, or the Murdoch system, is they have to read every letter that comes into the paper. And they open it and read the letter before you get it. And this poor little receptionist came up and she was shaking. She said, I've got a letter here for you. This man wants to kill you. And I just jumped down on my chair and went, yes, I made it. So, yes, you sort of, you do. You think, well, how did I get here?
So that was your first gold star, is that right?
That was new. I knew I'd made it because Larry said so. Mind you, I've had a few others after that, being in politics, as you can well imagine.
I certainly can. So, by definition, then, what would you say? It doesn't matter whether it's motor racing or political. What makes a good cartoon, and where does the idea come from? Is it something that just pops into your mind and you create both the graphic and the words that go with it as one entity?
Well, firstly, I would probably describe what people do for magazines and newspapers as editorial magazines. And so the news of the day is the topic. Then you have to make something out of that topic. Harking back to, say, the days of working for Paul Harrington, he was a great newspaper man. And he said, as long as the cartoons are topical, I'll print them. And so that's the rule of the thumb. The editor always has the say. And when I started at the news and they asked me to do a daily cartoon, I thought, shit, I don't know what I'm doing here. And so I decided to ring Jeff Hook at the Herald Sun in Melbourne, because that is an afternoon newspaper. And I said, Jeffrey, do you mind telling me what I need to do? And he said, yes, in the morning, we started at 4. You do 3 cartoons, just rough sketches, and you hand them to the editor. If you only give him one, you'll never get in. He'll use someone else somewhere else in the country. He said, if you give him 3 cartoons, you give him a choice. And then he will choose which one he wants to run with that he thinks topical, and then you ink that in, and then you're in for the day. And boy, that was some of the best advice I'd ever been given, because the news actually thought I knew what I was doing. It wasn't really. I had to ask somebody else. But so yes, you have to be topical. It has to be about the news of the day, and that was the same with motorsport as well as working for the news.
Yes, I guess in motorsport certainly there, depending entirely on the actual day concerned, there's always something going on. There are so many events of a major, minor and tiny levels at motorsport all the time, every weekend of the year pretty much. There's just so much cannon fodder out there for you to choose from. And of course, individual people within that environment provide you with either more or less, greater or smaller amounts of food for thought, because they are more controversial. They say things that are more interesting. They do things that are a little bit off the wall. And is that the kind of direction that you're looking for to actually create, or do you have ideas that fit around other people of your own?
I think most of the cartoonists that I've had the privilege of speaking to in the same business, if you like, say that it's like a blank piece of paper, and you start off and you create the stage, and then you put the characters on the stage, and then you give them speech clouds to what the script is. That's probably a very rudimentary example, but among a few of us, and I'm including in some of our older cartoonists that have been around, we used to say that the best cartoon is the cartoon that doesn't have a caption, and it doesn't need a caption. And it's very rare that you can sometimes do that it's sort of something which we all aspire to, is to do a cartoon that doesn't need words. Now, I've seen a few, and I've done a few myself, and I always thought, yeah, that's the best one I've done. People would ask me, how do you rate your best cartoon? I think, well, probably about 1 in 20 is okay, and that's about how you rate yourself.
It's interesting you say that, because one of my most memorable cartoons from Brockbank was one which was, again, early post-war period, sort of late 1940s, and it was a cartoon of a farmer driving along a country road heading towards a signpost which basically said motor racing ahead, and his truck was dropping hay bales off the back of it by accident, and there was a whole queue of cars, MGs and Singers and Rileys, following the farmer, and they were zigzagging through the hay bales. The cartoon did not need words.
Exactly, that's exactly right. And yes, Brockbank's a classic example, because it is the sport we love, and we can appreciate how that would happen. So that's apparently the key factor. Sometimes you stumble a bit. Sometimes working for a newspaper, they would come back to me, say, for the second edition, and say, we want to change the caption on the cartoon. Or the editor would come back to me and say, for the second edition, that other cartoon that you did on Bob Hawke rather than the one on Keating, can we do the Bob Hawke one? So I'd quickly do that off for the second edition. So the first edition had a different cartoon than the second edition. And that was common. That was common. And you had, like a journalist, you roll with what the editor wants.
Of course, you got paid double for that, right?
Oh, yeah, righto.
I just thought I'd ask.
I know.
Thanks for listening, and we hope you're enjoying this episode of the Australian Muscle Car Magazine podcast. To get access to every back issue and a stack of exclusive benefits, visit the website at musclecarmag.com.au and look for the premium tag. A whole new way to enjoy muscle cars. Now, back to the show.
My greatest payment at the Adelaide News was about July or August in 1984. I was sitting in the news, and suddenly one of the journos came up to me and he said, John Bannon's just announced that Adelaide's going to get a round of the World Formula One Championship right here in Adelaide through the parklands. And I thought I'd died and gone to heaven.
Yes, I can imagine. I think we all heard that announcement with something akin to, oh my God, is it actually true? And in the weeks and months that followed the announcement, there must have been so many cartoons that you created about the creation of the circuit, all the politics that surrounded it, the wonderful story about that row of palm trees that was planted and then vanished overnight. I mean, in the run-up to that first Australian Grand Prix or first Australian Formula One Grand Prix in 1985, how much fun did you have in that period?
Well, I was working in a newspaper, and I would say there was only 2 or 3 blokes in the newspaper that knew what a Grand Prix was or what to expect. Particularly the managing director. He said, what's all this crap about having a Grand Prix in our city? I don't get it, But I was very lucky that I had a few people there, like some of the sports editors. Frank Pangello was there at the time. He was one of them, and he was a Grand Prix freak. So he came up with the idea: is we've got to teach Adelaide who these people are and what the cars are. So what we'd come up with, because we had the last Grand Prix of the year during 1985, I drew collages of the cars and named the drivers, and we actually got Alan Jones to write a column, and later on Murray Walker, to match the centre spread, so that people in Adelaide could actually read about the cars, read about the drivers, and who to expect to see at the end of the year. So that was huge fun. But we were still I was surrounded by people in the newspaper that just thought it was just a load of crap. Why would we want to have a car race in the middle of the city? Until the first Formula One engine started up in the parklands. And then they all wanted a damn ticket to get in, didn't they?
Yes, and of course, you were the only one who had a connection with the people running the event. So everybody came to your desk, is that right?
Absolutely. In fact, it was Steve Middleton, the journo, who knew what a Grand Prix was. And this was still in 1984. He said to me, "We have to go to and have lunch with this Mal Hemmerling bloke to see what he's actually going to do." And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to," because I was a bit concerned about who was going to run this thing. And so we did. We had lunch with Mal. He told us exactly what his view was and how it should be run. And Middleton said, "Does he know what he's talking about?" I said, "This is great. He's not a motorsport fan. He's not a motorsport person. He is an organizer. He's a professor of computers. He's organising this as a major event. It just happens to be a Grand Prix." And that's how he did it. And he was a great delegator, and he had some great people working for him. And that's how it all came about. And I remember when Bernie Eccleston arrived at the Grand Prix, the first Grand Prix, and one of the things that Hemmerling did, he instigated what they call corporate stands. And on the top of the grandstands, there were these white, sort of like almost a tent enclosure, and they were corporate stands. And Bernie had never seen anything like this, but he got the idea from the golf. And we had them in Adelaide, and Bernie was just blown away. And I remember a comment that he made that was in the paper. He said, "Adelaide has changed Grand Prix racing forever, just by having these corporate stands." And that was one thing that Hemmerling did. He was very good. We were very lucky.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. The Australian Grand Prix in Formula One guys went up so many rungs on the ladder to anything that had previously been held. And going to Grand Prix, Formula One Grand Prix in Europe, generally speaking, the event had the Grand Prix and maybe, if you were lucky, one supporting race on the weekend. In Adelaide, of course, it had it was 4 days of support races for every major category in the country. And
yes,
again, that changed the landscape of Grand Prix everywhere else.
It certainly did. And we certainly, one other thing that the Grand Prix office did, which I thought was brilliant, was the first Grand Prix and all the others, and I think they did it in Melbourne too, was on the Thursday when all the international journalists arrived, they put on a barbecue for just the journalists. And I thought, boy, is that clever or what? Because they had the international press eating out of their hands. And, it was sort of just one of those little things that somebody else who was used to organising motor racing events probably wouldn't have thought of that.
Yes, what it did really was that it separated out the fact that the internationals, both the competitors in all the teams and particularly the media, were not. They were guests, and they were guests that we actually wanted in the country at the event. It wasn't a case of, "Oh, you guys are here to run a race." It was very much more a positive approach to it. And as you said, the media had never experienced anything on that scale before in pretty much anywhere else in the world.
No. I did laugh at Alan Henry, who was a great Grand Prix journalist. He said, "I love Adelaide." He said, "I can eat the food here." Everywhere he went else in the world, he always ate at McDonald's because he knew what he was going to get. But in Adelaide, he said, "I love it here." He said, "The food's wonderful." I said, "That's fine, but don't drink Adelaide water."
Yes, unless it's been brewed first.
Yes, exactly.
So tell me, along the way, you've met an awful lot of characters. I mean, you've been in and out of the back end of the pits and the paddock at the Formula One Grand Prix for decades. You've done so many characterisations of the drivers and the personalities. I know you've had a few, let's call them mild disagreements with some of them, but very much on the funny side. Okay, give us the top three of the people who sort of thought that they didn't like it, but really didn't complain too much.
Oh boy, no, they didn't really. For me personally, I'd never seemed to be able to draw a Jamie Whincup properly. I mean, he's got a cleft in his chin. He always wears spiky hair, but for some reason his face was always not able to be characterised. To my standard, anyway, I thought I always never got him right. And poor old Jamie used to worry about me. Jamie wasn't used to being criticised in any way. And so I was aware of that as well. Whereas Peter Brock, I used to draw him with a long, skinny nose, with sharp cheekbones and a long jaw. And it really didn't look anything like Brock, but everybody knew it was Brock, and Brock did too. He was quite good about it. I did have a problem with Alan Moffat and John Bow, because both of them came to me and said, in all seriousness, please, can you give us more hair?
Now, yes, for those people who don't have hair, the people who do have hair really don't understand how valuable it is until they don't have it anymore.
Yeah, John, if you could
exactly.
see me.
However, I should add that dear old Jack Brabham came to me one day and he said, can you stop drawing me with a part in the middle? I've never parted my hair in the middle. So I went back through all my old photos of Jack, and yes, he did part it in the middle. But he wouldn't admit it.
Now, there is a famous cartoon. I have a copy of it on my wall, which is the one that was... It was done as a private enterprise thing. It was supposed to be very much not for general circulation, but it just ended up that way. This was the cartoon strip, for want of a better expression, that surrounded a very famous Austrian racing car driver. And I'll let you tell the story simply because I think it should come from the horse's mouth.
Oh dear, yes, they say your sins come back to haunt you, and I think the Niki Lauda cartoon that I did is the classic example. I'm sure on my tombstone it'll have, this is the prick that wrote the Lauda cartoon. But it wasn't my joke. I went to England in 1977 and I went to the Austrian Grand Prix to see Niki drive his own home Grand Prix. I was a big fan of Niki. I still am. And of course, some Australian bloke called Alan Jones won his first Grand Prix, so that took it all away from poor old Nick. But I lived in Hampstead, and I used to go to the Roebuck Hotel in Pond Street, and across the road was the Royal Free Hospital. And in 1977, Niki Lauda won his second World Championship, and the doctors would come in and they'd stand in the doorway of the Roebuck Hotel, and they would say, who won the World Championship? And everybody in the pub would say, Lauda. And then he would scream it out, who won the World Championship? And it got so explicit with certain language that the publican, Dave Taylor, threw us all out in the street and said, stop yelling in my pub. So that's where it came from. All I did was I illustrated it, and I gave it to Frank Gardner. And because he said, I just want something to hang on my wall, like he said, just give me something rude, because he liked things that were rude. And so I gave this joke to him. He sent it to his mates in England. Not a good idea.
I can imagine it circulated through the British Racing Drivers Club like wildfire.
Well, yes, it did. A couple of mechanics who were Formula One mechanics I knew, and when they came back, they said to me, they came back you remember the Calder Grand Prix, Australian Grand Prix we used to have?
Yes, in the early 1980s.
Yes, and Lauda is actually one of them that came back, and one of the guys said to me, he said, there is a Lauda cartoon in every transporter in Formula One. And I thought, oh dear, I'm not sure whether I need this. But Lauda got his revenge on me. I think it was 94. It was 94 because we went to the Calder race and he was there, and Marlborough had a press conference for all the Marlborough drivers, and Peter Brock was there, John Harvey, Kiki Rosberg, and Niki Lauda, and I was quite friendly with Hutchison, who was the Marlborough pressman. And they all got up to leave at the end of the conference, and they were walking out, and all of a sudden someone grabbed me by the shoulders and pushed me into Lauda and said, "This is the man who did that cartoon." Now, if you have ever had a death stare from anybody, I got to tell you, to get a death stare from Niki Lauda will burn your brain out. He just looked at me and said, "I have seen it."
And that was it.
That was it.
Yes, Niki wasn't known for his sense of humour, kind of a national characteristic kind of thing. But did he? That was kind of it. It sort of just washed over after that, or did it sort of carry on for any length of time?
No, I believe. Actually, Alan Henry asked me for a copy of the cartoon at the Melbourne Grand Prix much later. I think it was about 2002. Alan Henry asked me, "Have you got a copy of that?" And I said, "I'll get you one." And I said, "Who's it for?" He said, "It's for Niki Lauda." He said he wanted to give it to someone. I said, "You're kidding me. You can't be right." He said, No, he wants to give it to someone, you know. So anyway, I said, do you want the rude one or do you want the abridged version? He said, "No, give me both."
Well, it's kind of...
Hopefully one day it will die and everybody will have forgotten it. But that cartoon has actually been copied by other people. I've got a copy here on my computer of Snoopy on top of his kennel, and he's saying the very words that the royal free doctors used to say at the
hotel.
At the pub. Yeah.
I mean, isn't it amazing that just one simple idea just becomes extrapolated right across the world and becomes almost folklore?
Yeah. Yes. I don't know. I as I said, it's one of those things that I don't know whether it was a good idea to give it to Frank Gardner. That was all.
Well, he was actually the person who commissioned it, so you couldn't really not give it to him, could you?
Well, no. That's true. Yes. Yeah. So anyway, as I said, your sins always come back to bite you.
Yes, they do eventually, if you live long enough, of course. On that basis, with all of the people that you've done caricatures of, who do you think was the hardest person to do? You said Jamie Whincup a little earlier. I mean, if you look across the board of motor racing in general, Formula One and touring cars in this kind of Australian motor racing, what are the one or two standouts that were difficult, and the ones that you really enjoyed?
That's an interesting question, because really I didn't really get to meet a lot of the people that I did caricatures of. As I said, Alan Moffat, I did quite a few caricatures of Alan and JB and Dick Johnson. Poor old Dick. Dick Johnson came to me one day and he said, "Mate, can you back off the bags under the eyes? I mean, really?" And I said, "Dick, if I removed the bags from under your eyes," I said, "you wouldn't look like you." And so that was one memorable one that I remember, but I didn't really have much problems. There was a few that I had to be careful of. And with respect, I'll have to say I really did, when I did a cartoon of Lewis Hamilton, I really tried to draw him in character, but also just be a little bit careful of his skin tone, because it was totally different than drawing anybody else. And so it wasn't anything, but the problem with Lewis Hamilton was always cutting his hair or changing his hair, or he'd got a new set of bling on his ear or whatever. But that was the only one I was deliberately careful how I finished it off, if you like.
Yeah, I understand. It is. It's kind of like a once only exercise.
Yes.
Completely out of left field, as it were. The ones that you enjoyed the most, who did you get the most fun out of, over the years in terms of their reaction to what you created as a cartoon? Not only the actual, the graphic image, but the words that went with it.
In most cases, I didn't have a problem. The only problem I had was Harry and Colin Bond would come to me with ideas for a cartoon, and I used to look at them and say, if I do that, we'll all end up in jail. And that was the only problem that I had with people that wanted something said, and they thought that the cartoon was the best way to do. But I did enjoy drawing Harry. The face, Harry's nose was just an absolute delight. His grey hair was always easy to do, as was Alan Moffat. I mean, I could just draw an onion with a set of glasses on it, and it would look like him. That wasn't too bad. I did have one problem one day. If you remember, in 1980, Peter Brock took over the Holden dealer team, and I can remember Vin Keane, who was the United Motors here in Adelaide. He virtually started the Holden dealer team. And he told Peter, if you can get Marlborough on board and if you can get Castrol on board, we'll come on board. So he put the Holden dealer team together, or put it back together. Well, let's say that. But you and I know, and we all knew, that Holden were going to be feeding in parts through the back door. Now, I did a cartoon of Peter just before Bathurst, and a girl was interviewing him, and she was saying in the speech cloud, by how many laps are you going to win Bathurst? And in the background, there was a door opening with a general coming in the back door. And when Peter caught up with me after that was published, he went ballistic. You knew you were in trouble when Peter Brock's eyeballs went black. And he was angry. And he said, mate, you have to be bloody careful. He said, the managing director of Holden's reads your cartoons. And I went and evacuated my bowels and changed my underwear after that, I can tell you.
Yes, I mean, that's kind of like, you talked about Niki Lauda's death steer. That would have been reasonably close to it, but with much, much more economic weight behind it. Oh, yes. Well, Peter was worried. It was a big venture for him, and we all know the history of that after that. It was just amazing. He kicked goals left, right and centre. And then, sadly, because I knew the family really well, I didn't know Peter first. I only met Peter through Philip Brock. And then I met his mum and dad. And then I met Auntie Marge and Uncle. I knew the whole family, Auntie Marge and Uncle Jack. They were at all the race meetings. And when the polarizer came on board, there were a lot of us, and you were one of them probably. We didn't know which way to swing. We didn't know whether this was good or bad or what. We didn't know anything about it. Even Frank Gardner was prepared to try it. So it was a very difficult time to know what to do. And so I stayed away from it. I elected not to do anything about it. So that was sad in some respects, because I felt sorry for the family as well. Yes, it's kind of that was you used exactly the right expression, a very difficult period of time for a lot of people within the industry. And we look back on it now with some degree of I guess sadness and trepidation as well. But if you move on through all of these decades, I mean, you've been in the game 6 decades now, and that's a long, long time. And you've had. It is a bit, isn't it? Well, it's sort of it's the greater part. You've been in this game far, far longer than you haven't been in this game. Put it that way. A few silly questions that people like myself would like to ask. There's things like, we all wish we'd done certain things or not done certain things. You've owned a lot of cars, as we all have. What's the car that you have owned that you wish you'd never sold? Yes, I have. I've had 6 Minis and 2 MGBs and a 240Z and, all the usual things that happen to be lying around a car yard that I thought I'd like to drive. But the car that I did sell eventually, and that was for a number of reasons, because my partner at the time had MS, was my 1750 GDV Alfa Romeo.
was just a good car. I always had another day drive car that, could have been a Holden or a Mitsubishi. But I had that for a long time. I took it in the Grand Prix rallies. I drove it for many, many years. Frank Gardner did the suspension for me. It was identified as an Alec Mildren car, which I had for 25 years. And that was probably the key, one of the key cars that I had. People like Mike Cable had a 2-litre, and he and I would just get together and chat about alphas and that sort of thing. So, but yeah, look, at the moment, I'm over 70. I've got to be careful what I can and get into and what I can get out of. And I've got a little 1990 Toyota MR2. It's an SW20. It's the little one the second one they made. It looks a little bit like a Ferrari. But I'm buoyed by my choice because John McCormick has got one, the Gold Star champion, and also a bloke called Colin Bond's got one too. So we regularly swap stories about what we're going to do to our MR2s. But I guess if I go back, yes, I've owned a lot of minis. They've been good fun, and they were workhorses really because I took them in events. So, but the Alpha was probably the nicest car I wish that I hadn't got rid of, but I did because someone offered me silly money for it.
Yes, it's a funny thing. We do exchange property for money, don't we? It seems to be a failing of men and motor cars. Okay, next question. The cars that you wish you had bought when they were cheap, and and you had the available money to buy it and put a silk car cover over it in a garage somewhere, lock it up, and say, I'll come back to that in 10 or 20 years' time. Give me a list of the top 3.
Oh dear. Well, I it sounds silly, but I had 2 MGB Roadsters, but I always hankered after having a V8 MG coupe, sort of the hardtop version.
Of the MG GT. Yeah.
Well, it had the longest car badge just in initials. It was called an MGB GT V8, and I always imagined that it would go right across the boot. But that was one that I thought, But there was a fellow called Andrew Rennie in Melbourne, and Andrew was an MG dealer, and he was putting V8s in MGBs back in 1977, and I always thought, gee, that'd be a hoot, So always thought that I'd like to get an MGB hatchback and have a nice V8 sitting in it. It would be a nice car to drive.
I can understand that. I really can. Now,
number 2.
Go on.
Number 2. Well, I always liked the 944 Porsche. I thought it was when I was a motoring writer, I actually road tested it, and I thought that 3-litre motor in the 944S was just a damn good motor, as close to the MGB and the Alpha that you'll get as a car, which I thought was a really lovely car to drive. But the one thing that stopped me is that damn bonnet badge. I just couldn't bring myself to be a Porsche driver.
Well, I
apologise in advance.
As we all know, Porsches are just Volkswagens with a college education.
But my last car that I always, the last one out of the 3 that you've asked about, is the one that I probably could never have afforded because I knew a fellow called Jeff Paradise who started Street Machine. I think you might even remember him.
I do.
Jeff had a red Pontiac Firebird 1968, which belonged to Johnny O'Keefe. And I was very envious when he bought that because I would have liked that car. I don't think I would have afforded it. Could have afforded it. I don't even know what he paid for it. But I assume he would have paid about $5,000 to $8,000 at the time because I reckon it would have been in 1979, 78, I reckon, that he bought that car. And he eventually sold it to Kerry Packer, so God knows where it is now. But that actually belonged to Johnny O'Keefe.
Yeah, well, that's good. That you would say that the pedigree of the car was probably worth more than the car.
Yes, that's often the case.
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
That's very, very true. Yes, yes. Well, it's the same with, people say, well, I bought a car that used to belong to, one famous one, of course, is one that belonged to Elvis Presley. It was a 507 Sports BMW that he bought back from Germany. And he eventually gave it to Ursula Andress, his co actress in one of the movies. I think it was Love in Acapulco or something. Ursula Andress was married to John Derrick. John Derrick already had one. He sold his to Fred Astaire to keep the Elvis one because he knew that the Elvis one would be worth a lot of dough. So yes, that's one example of someone who owned a car for a brief amount of time, and suddenly that singular car is worth so much money.
Okay, a question right out of left field. In cartooning, in motor racing, where did the seagull come from?
Oh, well, actually, it's interesting. Yeah, look, a lot of cartoonists have what they call an alter ego. They have something in their cartoon because actually cartooning can be quite boring, and sometimes you think you just want to put something in there to trick people. My two favourites are Paul Rigby, who's a Perth man who actually ended up with Murdoch in the New York Post, and he used to put a little boy and a dog in it, and it was in the cartoon, and sometimes he'd leave it out, and all these people would ring up the newspaper and say, where's the dog and the little boy? And that's how he knew whether anyone was reading his stuff, which I thought was very clever. The other one that I like is a guy called Murray Ball. Now, Murray Ball used to write a strip cartoon called Foot Rot Flats. Now, I don't know whether you've ever seen one, but he's got all these farm animals because Murray was actually a dairy farmer. And in his Foot Rot Flats cartoons, all the animals had names except the dog. The dog didn't have a name, and the dog was him. And I thought that was very, very clever. So getting back to me, I always thought I always liked seagulls. I mean, so they used to go down the beach and chase birds, and then when it was rough, they'd go and watch the cricket. Now, that's my alter ego.
So you felt you were one of the seagulls sitting on the outfield on the grass.
Well, yeah. And so I used him in motorsport as the guy that, he usually stood behind the wrong side of the armco making some stupid comment or some comment that probably no one wanted to hear. So that's the idea of it. And there are many cartoonists that I can give you that they do deliberately put something in their cartoon. So some don't, but and that's It's called an alter ego. It's part of the cartoon, and so I used to draw him or that seagull in just about everything I did, just as more or less part of the signature. I guess I suppose it worked out to be.
Well, he almost becomes the spokesman, doesn't he?
In some respects, yes. It's sort of like if people used to deliberately look for the cartoon to see what the seagull would say. And so, in actual fact, I actually did a strip of him on a regular basis in auto action for a while. No, it wasn't auto action. It might have been checkered flag. Yeah, just a little strip. And the other guy who's in the Niki Lauda cartoon is actually a wood duck, but he's actually a chicken hawk. So you've got the two, and those two birds were featured in the Niki Lauda cartoon.
Yes.
And you don't ask me why. I just did it.
Well, I think creative people don't quite frequently they do not understand where the idea came from or the execution of the idea. Right. It just materialises out of nowhere. Yep.
Well, there's plenty of cartoons I look at and said, oh my God, how did I do that? Why did I do that? It's you don't regret it because once it's down, it's down. But Yeah, I don't know. I can't tell you where it comes from. It's just one of those things.
We live in a time now of the dreaded political correctness. How much has that affected the way cartoonists can present their material?
I think most cartoonists would be aware that there is an invisible line, and that invisible line is a line that you don't cross. And I can't tell you where we all set that line, but it is a benchmark of there are some things that you just don't say. And I was a huge fan, still am a huge fan of Bill Leak. And I think in the situation and towards the end there that it was very, very sad that Bill just put his foot over the line a bit by commenting on an Indigenous person couldn't remember the name of his son. And he was, vilified for it. And that's where the invisible line is. And that's what I love about when I work for magazines. I work with editors who will be prepared to edit me, because they, of all people, should know where that invisible line is. Some of them don't, and some of them do. I don't know how that would have got in the paper, the one of Bill Leak's, but it did. So I got to ask the question, who was the editor of the day? And that's why I used to do 3 cartoons a day for my editor at the Adelaide News, because it gave him a choice and it gave me a choice. And we also had the situation where when it was finished, we could also decide again whether we put it in or not. And so, yeah, it's just an invisible line. Don't tell me how you recognise where it is, but you when you draw it and you look at it and you think, no, I'm not going to say that, I'll change that, or I'll change the caption. Because that's, it's just called an invisible line. And I've spoken about it to many other cartoonists, and they just roll their eyes and say, yeah, I wish we knew, identify it more.
I think it's a movable feast, isn't it, really? It moves up and down, sideways on the day.
Geez. Yeah. Well, I think of the things they used to say in Monty Python. I was a big fan of Monty Python. And I was a big fan of the Bugs Bunny show. And, if you look at it now, you think, oh, gee whiz, they wouldn't get away with it these days.
You wouldn't get it off the floor, would you? Not a chance.
No.
Not a chance. Okay, a last question for you. What is the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
Oh, dear. Apart from I have to think about that. I suppose the guy in England, the former cartoonist club president, was, you'll never be a cartoonist unless you do politics, because that sows a seed in your head, and you think, how am I going to achieve that? Particularly when you're on the outside of the newspaper industry and you have no idea how to get in. But also there's been quite a few over the years, I guess, of people that I like to listen to people because they're smarter than me anyway. And I think one of the things that I most enjoyed, and I cried like a baby when he passed away, was some of the things that Frank Gardner said to me and advised me on, and of all sorts. But I do remember him putting his hand on my shoulder when I did the Frank Gardner driving school in Formula Fords, and he said, son, if you want to be a good cartoonist, go overseas and broaden your ears. And I thought, that's pretty good. So I packed up my bongos and I went overseas. But Frank was my mentor, and he taught me a lot of things. So obviously you listen to people like that.
Yes, anybody who disparaged or underrated Frank's intelligence did so at their own peril.
Yeah, very interesting man. He got me to do drawings of things that I didn't know what I was drawing. And he said, you don't need to know, John. I'm just wanting you to draw this because I'm going to send it to somebody, and you don't need to know what it is. A couple of things I twigged that he was drawing, especially when he was developing the M3 BMWs. He was changing things on those cars and then sending drawings back. But there was a couple of other things that Frank used to get involved in. He was very interested in another source of energy. He often got me to draw things that looked a little bit like a piston and a prop or whatever, but it wasn't. It was something else. And he said, I just want you to do these diagrams. And so, he was a very interesting bloke, and very, very, very smart. Not always liked because of his attitude and or the way he presented himself. But those of us who got to know him, I think we were very rewarded by having known him.
I couldn't agree with you more. Look, John, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. I've really enjoyed it. We've known each other for a very, very long time. We've had a lot of fun together. We've had lots of meals together. We've lots of drinks together. We hope to continue doing that for many years to come.
Yes, mate. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity.
A real pleasure. Thank you very much. Cheerio.
That brings us to the end of the episode. Huge thanks to our guest and our host, and we hope you've enjoyed hearing from one of the people that make the Australian muscle car community what it is. See you next time on the Australian Muscle Car Magazine podcast, and until then, happy driving.